Hello and welcome to video lecture series in Political Science. Today we are going to discuss chapter 2 titled as Freedom from your 11th class textbook Political Theory. For understanding, we have divided this chapter into 4 parts. So far we have discussed about what is meant by freedom, how do political theorists define freedom, why do we need rules and constraints, and we have differentiated between the self-regarding and other regarding actions. Today in this episode, we will discuss what are the areas where we need to put constraints, and we will distinguish between positive and negative liberty, and we will talk about freedom of expression. So far we have discussed that freedom means no constraints, and it also means giving people opportunity to grow their capabilities. But at the same time, freedom also needs to be regulated through some constraint, rules or regulation, in order to secure and guarantee freedom to everybody in society. In diverse societies, people should learn to accommodate and tolerate different ways of lives of people, different perspectives, point of views of others and interest of other people. But once again, such tolerance cannot be stretched beyond a limit, that is, the extent of putting people into danger or generating hatred must be avoided. Let us take an example of freedom of speech and hate campaigns as an example of that how this tolerance must not go beyond a limit. Hate campaigns or hate speeches can be dangerous for life of some people, and they can also cause serious harm to some communities. There is a need to constrain or control such actions, as these can generate conflict between groups and incite or provoke fight among different communities. But you can also argue that if you put constraint or impose restrictions on such actions, then are you not curtailing the right of freedom of speech and expression of a particular individual who is giving this hate speech? What do we do in such situations? How do we restrict such kind of acts in a society? In such cases, some type of restrictions are placed on the movement of the individual who is delivering these hate speeches. The law may ban him from entering a particular public area or a specific area for a particular period of time. He or she may not be allowed to hold public meetings, deliver public speeches, write or broadcast his views on TV or radio. These justifiable constraints or restrictions are called as reasonable restrictions. The restrictions imposed upon the individual may be there, but they must be reasonable also. They should not be out of proportion. That is, they must be capable of being defended by reason. They must not be excessive. They should not be out of proportion to the action being done by the person. As if we take some out of proportion action, it would affect the general condition of freedom of people in society. So, small action requires small reprimanding and big action requires use of some law or force to intervene in. Any small action and its assumed consequences should not call for instant imposition of constraints in any given society, that is, quickly call the law or call the police to take care of the situation. Within this context, it would be important to discuss about or distinguish between the notion of positive and negative liberty. The idea of positive and negative liberty is given by Isaiah Berlin. But let us first understand what do we mean by liberty. Liberty means freedom from arbitrary control. It means freedom or independence from external or foreign rule. Liberty can also be understood as freedom from control, interference, any obligation on an individual, restriction or hampering conditions, etc. It can also be understood as power or right of doing, thinking, speaking according to an individual's choice. Liberty is also defined as freedom from captivity, confinement or physical restraint. Now, let us differentiate between the positive and negative liberty. Positive liberty looks at the relationship between individual and society. It is concerned with existing conditions and improving the conditions so that individuals can grow and develop freely without constraint or fear of any constraint. In order to develop his or her capabilities to the best, an individual must have or must be given enabling positive conditions that help him to grow. These conditions can be political, they can be social, economic or material condition. For example, an individual must not be constrained by lack of resources. They must have opportunity to participate in decision making process so that their choices are reflected in laws, or at least their preferences are accounted for while drafting these laws. Individuals, say for example, must have access to education and other opportunities to grow in a reasonably good fashion or manner. Interestingly, you will be surprised to know that positive liberty recognizes that one can be free only in a society or in a social group. Thus, positive liberty advocates for making such a society that enables individuals to develop their potential and capabilities. In contrast, unlike the positive liberty, negative liberty deals with only inviolable area of non-interference, that is, the areas or one limited area in which action of an individual must not be constrained or where there should be no restriction. It does not deal with conditions in society, although those who talk of negative liberty would advocate for maximization of this minimum area in which the individual should not be constrained. But generally, for a stable society, both positive and negative liberty are important. If we look at societies ruled by dictators or autocrats, we will see that these autocrats or dictators give you positive conditions or positive liberty, that is, conducive conditions to grow your capabilities. However, they restrict your area of independence, that is, the negative liberty. Now, let us talk of freedom of expression as an example of negative liberty in greater detail. Freedom of expression belongs to the minimum area of non-interference which should not be restricted. That is, individual must be given freedom to express himself. Freedom of expression is a fundamental value and society and governments must ensure it for every individual or member in society and citizen in the state. In one of the famous statements, Voltaire was a famous French Enlightenment writer, historian and a philosopher. Voltaire had said, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to death your right to say it." This statement is the best expression of how deeply are we committed to the idea of freedom of expression. J.S. Mill passionately defended freedom of expression for individuals. According to Mill, freedom of expression must be guaranteed, and this includes freedom of thought and discussion also, not just speech or expression. In his book titled as On Liberty, Mill reasons out why there should be freedom of expression even for those who espouse ideas that appear to be false or misleading at times. Mill says freedom of expression must be protected because of 4 important reasons. Let us look at these 4 important reasons. The first is that no idea can be said to be completely false. What appears to us as a false idea may contain some element of truth in it. If we ban these ideas, considering them as false ideas, we would lose the element of truth that these ideas contain. The second point or the second reason is related to the first point only, and it says that the truth does not emerge by itself. It is only through a dialectics or conflict of opposing idea that truth emerges, that is, through debate and discussions. Ideas that seem to be wrong at one point of time may over a period of time become important ideas or valid ideas. The third point is that the conflict of ideas is significant not just in the past, but is of continuing value for all times to come. Truth always runs the risk of being reduced to an unthinking cliche. Cliche means something which has been repeated many a times. It is only when we expose it to the opposing views that we can be sure of that this idea is trustworthy. This sounds confusing. What does this mean? It means that when ideas are brought one against the other, they stand test of strength and worthiness. They compete with each other and then are either proved or disproved. Finally, the fourth point is that one cannot be sure that what we consider as true or valid is actually true or not. Often ideas that were considered false at one point of time in the entire society and were suppressed turned out to be true or valid later on. A society that turns to suppress ideas that are not acceptable today runs the danger or has the risk of losing the benefits of what might turn out to be valuable knowledge in future. For example, the voices of the social reformers in early 19th century in India were suppressed. The ideas of the social reformers were seen as a challenge or threat to the society. At that point of time, only tradition was seen as the ultimate truth, and that must be accepted and followed, mindlessly even at times. Any attempt to modernize or challenge the tradition was unacceptable in society, like when they said girls must be educated, when they talk about women's rights or abolition of sati, etc. All these ideas were not accepted. They were seen as a challenge to the existing tradition. Now, a century later, or more than 150 years, we see that the modern ideas that once upon a time were not acceptable are the significant ideas that change the nature of Indian society forever. Thus, freedom of expression gives individual an opportunity to say and express what he intends to do. Initially, or at times, it may seem to be wrong. However, in the course of time, it may find its place and worth in the society or among people. So, what are the two important things that we can learn out of this explanation? These are that truth may be dependent upon time and space. What may not be considered as true or valid now may become so over a period of time, and also what may be true in one space may not be so in the other space. A variety of social, legal, political constraints act upon people in different situations, in different time and spaces. When such constraints are backed or sanctioned by social, religious or cultural authorities, then it may be difficult for us to challenge them. For example, some communities may prescribe a kind of dressing pattern for women or men, and this comes with religious sanctions. It is very difficult to challenge them. But if we are accepting these constraints willingly, voluntarily, that I want to do this, then we cannot say that my freedom is being restricted, or we cannot say, or you cannot claim that your freedom is being constrained. We have accepted these norms by choice. They are not imposed upon us. So, the question of curtailing freedom through force does not arise in such kind of situations. In brief, we can say freedom is absence of constraints. It is also a condition that gives individuals scope to develop their capabilities. But freedom cannot go unchecked as well, because your freedom can also harm someone else's freedom. You can step upon somebody's foot. Freedom can also be defined in terms of giving people positive liberty, that is enabling condition, and negative liberty, that is the minimum area where your freedom must not be hampered with. Here we define the areas where people should not be controlled, and also the areas where the rights of an individual are defined or predefined. Thus, we put checks in order to balance freedom of all in society. These checks or restrictions give us capacity to make right choices and exercise our freedom with due diligence, that is intelligence and mindfulness. Education and cultivation of ability to fairly judge also helps us in this process. This chapter is on freedom, and this chapter on freedom is first instance to know how knowledge of political theory helps us in our everyday life. It helps us to know and understand more about our freedom. It helps us to explore meanings and ideas more deeply and meaningfully. To conclude this episode, let's summarize what we discussed in this entire chapter. In this chapter, we discussed about what is freedom, how do political scientists define freedom, we discussed about the freedom struggle and about the freedom fighters. We discussed about importance of freedom for individuals and society. Briefly, we discussed about the harm principle, what is liberty, and we also differentiated between positive and negative liberty. In the entire context, we also discussed about why do we need to put constraint on the freedom of the individual. We discussed what is freedom of expression and why it must be guaranteed to individuals in society. So, this is about freedom in brief to begin with. Enjoy reading this chapter. Thank you.